There's a strange moment that happens in life. Everything is already difficult. You're under pressure. You're tired. You're uncertain about what comes next. And then, somehow, you make things even harder. You replay one conversation in your head. You convince yourself that you're going to fail. You delay something important because you're afraid of getting it wrong. You become impatient. You react emotionally, or you simply give up. And afterward, when the pressure is gone, you look back and think, why did I do that? That question is more important than it seems, because sometimes the biggest obstacle standing between you and the life you want isn't another person. It isn't bad luck. It isn't even the situation itself. It's the way your mind responds when the pressure becomes intense. Your brain is designed to protect you, but protection and progress are not always the same thing. When you feel threatened, uncertain, embarrassed, rejected, or overwhelmed, your brain can start prioritizing immediate emotional relief over long-term success, and that creates a dangerous pattern. The worse the situation feels, the more desperately you want to escape the feeling. And the faster you try to escape it, the more likely you are to make decisions that create even bigger problems later. The fascinating part is that this doesn't usually happen because you're weak. It happens because your brain is doing something it has learned to do. And once you understand that pattern, you can start interrupting it. Because the moment you recognize what your mind is doing, you stop being completely controlled by it. So let's look at why you become your own worst enemy precisely when you need yourself the most. And the first reason is something almost everyone experiences. Point 1. Pressure shrinks your thinking. When everything is calm, you can see possibilities. When you're under pressure, your world can suddenly become very small. Psychologists often describe this as attentional narrowing. Your brain starts focusing intensely on whatever feels most threatening. Instead of asking, what are all my options? You start asking, how do I make this feeling stop? That is a huge difference. Imagine you're facing an important decision. Normally, you might consider several possibilities. But when the pressure rises, your brain starts searching for the fastest escape route. You might think, I need to fix this right now. I can't mess this up. What if everything goes wrong? What if people judge me? And suddenly, you're no longer solving the actual problem. You're trying to escape the anxiety surrounding the problem. That's when people make impulsive choices. They send messages they later regret. They make decisions without thinking. They abandon goals that actually matter to them. They avoid difficult conversations. They procrastinate on important tasks because avoiding them provides temporary relief. And here's the trap. Temporary relief feels like success. You avoid the uncomfortable task, and for a few minutes, you feel better. You delay the decision, and the anxiety drops. You stop trying, and the fear of failure disappears. But the problem hasn't disappeared. You've simply transferred the discomfort from the present into the future. And future you eventually has to pay the bill. This is why one of the most powerful things you can learn is simple. Don't make permanent decisions just to escape temporary emotions. When pressure rises, slow yourself down. You don't need to solve your entire life in one emotional moment. Sometimes the smartest move is simply creating enough distance to think clearly again. Because when your emotions are screaming, your brain needs space before it can reason properly. And that leads to the second reason you become your own worst enemy. Point 2. You start believing your thoughts are facts. Your brain produces thousands of thoughts, but just because your mind says something doesn't mean it's true. Under stress, this becomes especially dangerous. You might think, I'm going to fail. They probably hate me. I always mess things up. I'm not capable of this. This is never going to work. Notice something. These thoughts sound like conclusions, but they're actually predictions. And your brain can become extremely convincing when you're emotional. A thought appears. You believe it. Your emotions react to it. Then your behavior follows. And suddenly, one thought has created an entire chain reaction. This is where cognitive distortions can become powerful. Your mind may exaggerate the worst possible outcome. It may turn one mistake into evidence that you always fail. It may treat uncertainty as proof that something bad is coming. And it may make you focus on the one negative detail while ignoring everything that contradicts it. The problem isn't having negative thoughts. Everyone has them. The problem is automatically obeying them. Think about the difference between saying, "I'm going to fail," and saying, "I'm worried that I might fail." The first sounds like reality. The second acknowledges that it's an emotion and a possibility. That tiny change creates psychological distance. And psychological distance gives you something incredibly valuable: choice. You can observe the thought without immediately becoming the thought. So the next time your mind tells you something dramatic during a stressful moment, ask, is this a fact, or is this my fear making a prediction? That question can interrupt an entire spiral. But there's an even deeper reason we sabotage ourselves under pressure. And it has to do with something your brain wants more than success. It wants certainty. Point 3. Your brain prefers certainty over growth. Your brain doesn't necessarily want you to become more successful. It wants you to survive, stay safe, and conserve energy. That means unfamiliar situations can feel threatening. Growth is unfamiliar. Speaking up can be unfamiliar. Starting something new is unfamiliar. Changing your identity is unfamiliar. Even positive change can create stress because your brain doesn't know exactly what happens next. That's why you can desperately want something and still feel tempted to avoid it. You may want confidence, but confidence requires doing things that initially feel uncomfortable. You may want independence, but independence means making decisions without always knowing the outcome. You may want success, but success requires tolerating uncertainty. And your brain may respond by saying, maybe stay where you are, maybe wait, maybe tomorrow, maybe you're not ready. It sounds reasonable. But sometimes "I'm not ready" is simply fear wearing a sophisticated disguise. This is why comfort can become dangerous. Not because comfort is bad, but because too much comfort teaches your brain that discomfort is something to escape. And once your brain learns that pattern, every challenge feels bigger than it actually is. The solution isn't to eliminate fear. It's to teach your brain, I can feel uncomfortable and still move forward. That is a completely different mindset. You don't need to feel confident before taking action. Sometimes confidence comes after you prove to yourself that you can act while feeling uncertain. And that brings us to another hidden enemy, because sometimes the pressure doesn't come from what's happening around you. It comes from the impossible standards you create inside your own head. Point 4. Perfectionism turns mistakes into threats. Perfectionism often looks like ambition, but underneath it, there can be a deep fear of being wrong. You tell yourself, if I'm going to do it, I need to do it perfectly. Sounds impressive, but eventually, perfection becomes so difficult to reach that starting feels dangerous. You hesitate, you over-prepare, you keep editing, you wait for the perfect moment, and eventually, nothing happens. This is one of the cruelest forms of self-sabotage because it can look productive from the outside. You're planning, you're researching, you're preparing, you're thinking, but thinking can become a hiding place. At some point, action becomes necessary, and action creates the possibility of imperfection. That's why perfectionists sometimes struggle most when something actually matters. The higher the stakes feel, the more pressure they create. And the more pressure they create, the harder it becomes to perform naturally. Instead of asking, "How can I do this perfectly?" try asking, "How can I do this well enough to move forward?" That question changes the game. Progress requires room for mistakes. You cannot learn without being wrong sometimes. You cannot become confident without experiencing moments of uncertainty. And you cannot build resilience without encountering situations that test you, which leads to one of the most important psychological patterns of all. Point 5. You confuse emotional discomfort with danger. Your brain can react to emotional discomfort as if something terrible is happening. But discomfort and danger are not the same thing. Feeling embarrassed isn't the same as being unsafe. Feeling uncertain isn't the same as being doomed. Feeling rejected doesn't mean you're worthless. Feeling nervous doesn't mean you're incapable. Yet your brain can blur these categories. And when it does, you start treating normal emotional experiences like emergencies. That's when you might avoid opportunities simply because they make you uncomfortable. You stop yourself from speaking because you're afraid of judgment. You avoid trying because failure would feel painful. You retreat because uncertainty feels overwhelming. But every time you escape harmless discomfort, your brain learns that situation was dangerous. And next time, the fear can become even stronger. This is why courage isn't the absence of discomfort. Courage is learning that discomfort can exist without controlling your behavior. You can be nervous and still speak. You can be uncertain and still decide. You can be disappointed and still continue. You can be afraid and still take the next step. That's how psychological resilience develops. Not by making every difficult feeling disappear, but by discovering that you can survive the feeling without allowing it to make your decisions. And now we reach the final piece. Because sometimes the reason you become your own worst enemy isn't that you think too much. It's that you think about yourself too much. Point 6. Self-focus can turn into self-sabotage. When you're under pressure, your attention can become intensely self-focused. How do I look? What are they thinking? Did I say something stupid? What if they notice I'm nervous? What if I fail? The more attention you place on yourself, the more pressure you create. And the more pressure you create, the more unnatural your behavior becomes. This is why being obsessed with how you're performing can actually hurt your performance. Your attention gets trapped inside your own head. Instead of focusing on the task, you focus on how you're doing the task. Instead of listening, you're monitoring yourself. Listening. Instead of communicating, you're analyzing every word before you say it. The solution is to shift your attention outward. Focus on the conversation instead of your performance. Focus on the next action instead of the entire outcome. Focus on what you can control instead of everything that could go wrong. Your brain needs a target. Give it one. And when you do, something interesting happens. The mental noise begins to lose power. You stop asking, "How am I doing?" and start asking, "What needs to happen next?" That question is incredibly grounding because you don't need to control the entire future. You only need to handle the next meaningful action. And sometimes that is the difference between spiraling and moving forward. The most dangerous moment isn't always when life goes wrong. Sometimes it's the moment when life goes wrong and you decide that everything you're feeling must be true. That's when fear becomes a prediction, a mistake becomes an identity, uncertainty becomes danger, discomfort becomes a reason to quit, and one bad moment starts controlling the next one. But you can interrupt that pattern. You can pause before reacting. You can question your thoughts. You can separate facts from fears. You can allow discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. You can replace perfection with progress. And most importantly, you can stop treating every difficult emotion like an emergency. Because your mind will sometimes tell you to run when what you actually need is to stay calm. It will tell you that you're not ready when what you really need is one small step. It will tell you that one failure defines you when it was simply one moment. And it will sometimes convince you that you are the problem when you're simply overwhelmed. So the next time life puts you under pressure, remember this. You don't have to believe every thought your mind produces. You don't have to act on every emotion you feel. And you don't have to solve everything at once. Pause. Breathe. Create space. Then ask yourself one question. What would I do right now if fear wasn't making the decision for me? You may not know the answer immediately, but asking the question changes your position. Because now you're no longer fighting yourself. You're learning to understand yourself. And that is where real self-control begins. Not when your mind becomes silent, but when your mind can be loud and you still choose your next move.